is. So this week, because you're trying to turn in your final project, we are going to look at common errors in the project. And some of those common errors, and I decided to put in bullet points or check boxes, is mixing up M and B. So mixing up the meanings of the two. Saying y over x instead of change in y over change in x. Remember, when we're talking about slope, it's the change in y over the change in x, not y over x. Another common mistake is not labeling your graphs. Some of you guys are not graphing correctly, and when you don't label them, we can tell that you're not graphing correctly because you're trying to hide the fact that the graph is not done correctly. Missing or unclear slope triangles. Make sure you draw your slope triangles showing the change in y, showing the change in x. When you draw your slope triangles, it helps identify the points correctly because some students are doing incorrect points. So make sure you draw slope triangles for each of your graphs. The next thing is not properly explaining how M and B are used in the table graphing equation. Explanation is super short, so it doesn't really show a deep level of understanding. And then lastly, not watching the video. When we read your work, we can easily tell if you watched the video or not, because if you watch the video, your ability to follow instructions is a lot stronger than those who did not watch the video, where we're like, did you even follow instructions? So please make sure you're watching the video. So next up, this is where I need some audience participation. Confusion over M. This student wrote, I added 1 on the x-axis and subtracted 4 on the y-axis and had a slope of 10. Can I get a volunteer to raise their hand to identify what the mistake is? I added 1 on the x-axis and subtracted 4 on the y-axis and had a slope of 10. So I'll wait until I get some feedback. Go ahead, Sandra. Can you explain what the error is?
Is it because you never explained how we got the slope?
Okay, what do you think the slope should be based on this work right here? They're talking about I added 1 on the x-axis and subtracted 4 on the y-axis. Based on that information, what should the slope be?
4?
4, yeah. It's actually -4 because they subtracted 4, right? So when this student says added 1 on the x-axis, they're talking about, they should say added 1, the change in x is adding 1. So the change in x is +1, and the change in y is -4. But the slope should be -4 over 1 because the change in y is subtracting 4 and the change in x is +1. So please make sure you are not confusing your M. They say one thing right here and then they give us a different slope. These slopes do not match with each other. Thank you, Sandra, for volunteering. Okay, we're going to move on to the next slide. Confusion over B. So take a look at the equation, take a look at B, take a look at the table. What is wrong with this work? Go ahead, Richard.
For the table where x is 0, the y should be 10.
Yes. This 4, I think it's supposed to refer to the slope, but it can't, if you're talking that your B value, your y-intercept is 10, your power 0 is 10, and right here B is 10, you can't have it saying 4. These do not match. So please make sure when you're doing your equation, your table, your graph, all of them are related, that they're not mismatching. Because when you mismatch, This shows confusion over your understanding of what slope, y-intercept mean. Okay, we're gonna move on to the next one. Drawing slope triangles and label the points. So this one's a little tricky. Take a look at the work very closely. One of these points do not belong. Can you see which point does not belong? And explain why. So look at these points. There's a point right here, a point right here, point right here, point right here, and a point right here. Anyone see the mistake? Okay, so maybe if you're not, oh, go ahead, Isa. What do you think the mistake is? Sorry, can you say that again?
I'm not sure.
Okay. Does anyone see the mistake? Okay, so I'm going to make a table to help make it a little clearer. Just give me a second, having some technical issues. Can you guys see my cursor move? Just checking. Can someone speak up or type in the chat? Can you see me move my cursor?
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you. So if we take a look at the first x value for this point, it says -1, -5. So -1 on the x, -5 for the y. Then our next point says 0, -3. Our next point says 1, -1. Our next point says 2, 0. And our last point says 3, 3. Raise your hand if you see the error. Maybe this makes it a little clearer. Let me see. Miss Up. Wait, actually, I can look at managed participants. Who has their hands up? 2, can you explain what error you see?
For the value of x, it's supposed to be 1 and not 0.
For the value of x, it should, say that one more time.
For x equals 2, for the y, it's supposed to be 1.
Yes. So instead of 0, this should equal to 1. And one of the reasons why this student made that error is because they didn't draw slope triangles. They just drew a line and they're like, okay, it connects at this point. So if it connects at this point, this must actually be a point. As a reminder, this graph is not drawn accurately. It's a sketch. So don't assume just because it's on the line, that is exactly the point on there. Because the spacing is not equal, right? So don't assume that 2, 0 is a point. It's actually 2, 1. And to make sure you avoid that mistake, please draw your slope triangles. It helps minimize the errors, okay? So it should have been at 2, 1 instead of 2, 0. Okay, so next up, we are going to look at the next mistake. Okay, lack of explanations. This is the killer one. Take a look at the work of the student that had to revise And then take a look at the work of a student who earned an A for their draft. And this is both draft of chapter 2. What are some differences you notice between these two individuals? Isa.
One has a lot of explaining and the other has none or very little.
Yeah. So the student on the left did all this math and explained all their math in literally 2 sentences. There was a lot more steps than just 2 steps when you did this, when you do this problem. There's a process to making a table. There's a process for making the graph. There's a process for finding the slope. There's a process of finding the y-intercept. There's a process for writing the equation. You can't describe all these processes in 2 sentences. It's like when we do the verbal quiz where I spin the pen. Do you guys remember that? Where I spin the pen and then
Yes.
you guys explain? Yes. When I spin the pen and you guys explain, I'm not looking for a 1 sentence explanation. I'm looking for a detailed explanation to see if you understand the content. So just explaining in 2 sentences is not enough. The student on the right earned an A on the draft, and it was very detailed. Literally spent over a paragraph explaining how they did their table. Then they spent another paragraph explaining how they did their graph. So it's very, very detailed. So typically when you are writing your explanations, expect to have 2 or more paragraphs for each chapter. In fact, I did the entire project, and I'll show you. I did it myself. I have an answer key, but you know, everyone has their own problems. And you will see that when I'm writing, it's definitely taking more than a couple sentences to explain everything. So let me go to the answer keys. And here's my chapter 1. I'll just skim through it so you can see. This is me writing chapter 1, about 3 pages for chapter 1. Then here's me doing chapter 2. And then here's me doing chapter 3. So you can see all together, I think I have 3, 2, 2. That's a total of 7 pages already, just for 3 chapters. Don't expect to do each chapter 1 page long. It is not enough. This week's word of the week, and you want to make sure you write on the top of your paper, so at the very top of your paper, and that's how I can tell if you're watching the video, is explain clearly. The word of the week is explain clearly. I'll type it in the chat. Explain clearly is the word of the week. And that's the word of the week because students are not explaining clearly. They're writing a couple sentences to explain the entire chapter. And then the last common mistake is they're not watching the video. I can tell if you're not watching the video because of the following. Take a look at what the student did, just reading their sentences. What do you notice about their explanation of each one of these concepts? Proportional, steepness, parallel, and perpendicular. Raise your hand if you see the error. So what is wrong with the way they describe proportional, steepness, parallel, and perpendicular? Go ahead, Sandra.
Sorry?
Go ahead. Can you describe the error?
The equations for proportional isn't proportional.
Not looking at the word, just looking at the way to describe each of these words.
Oh,
Proportional, steepness, parallel, and perpendicular.
the explanations are really vague, so you don't really fully understand it.
Okay. Thank you for sharing that. 2, your thoughts?
It's all referring to a graph.
It's all referring to a graph. Yeah, that's true also. So you two are both correct. So Sandra said that the explanations are vague. It's not clear enough to understand if they really understand the definition. And 2 also added that no graph, right? If you don't have a graph, it makes it a little harder to understand. I also want to add that each of these definitions are actually incorrect. Proportional does not mean lines are straight. All lines are straight. So you can't say proportional means lines are straight. Steepness doesn't involve about vertical and almost going straight. All lines are straight, so that doesn't determine whether something is steeper. Parallel, similar position, needs more information. I think a graph would be helpful. This is a vague explanation of what parallel means. And then perpendicular, crossing each other and have the same y-intercept. That's not the definition of perpendicular. So if you watch the video, I explain what proportional means, what non-proportional means, how you can organize your equations by steepness, how you can determine when something is parallel or not, and how can you determine when equations are perpendicular. And this student, it's not clear that the student watched the video because of the vague responses. And also there's a lack of the word of the week. So they might have just done this on their own without watching the video. So please make sure you're watching the video. And as a reminder, these are the common errors that exist from chapters 2 and 3 specifically. And the sooner that you turn in your chapters, the quicker you can get feedback over how you're doing. As a reminder, May 5th is going to be the due date for your y equals mx plus b book project, and it's worth 100 points.